After his stepmother told him he'd inherited a worthless auto shop in the middle of nowhere, a boy with nothing left to lose went to claim it. What he found inside wasn't just about debt or inheritance. It was about a truth that would change the entire story of his life. If you've ever felt like you were completely on your own, I think this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're about to go on a journey together. It started on the morning of my 18th birthday. There was no cake, no cards, just a single sealed manila envelope on the kitchen counter, propped against the salt shaker. My stepmother, Claire, was standing by the stove, her back to me, stirring oatmeal that I knew wasn't for me. The silence in that kitchen was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered sound. For the last 2 years, since my dad passed, that silence had been her favorite weapon. It was cleaner than yelling, more effective. "Happy birthday, Leo," she said, her voice flat, not turning around. The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't say thank you. I just stared at the envelope. My name was written on it in her neat, tight script. It looked like a final bill. I picked it up. It was heavy. Not just paper heavy. There was a lump inside, something solid and metallic. "You're an adult now," she continued, the spoon scraping rhythmically against the pot. "That means you're on your own," as was the agreement. The agreement. A one-sided contract I'd been made to understand without ever signing. The day I turned 18, I was out. Her house, her rules. My dad had made a bad choice marrying her, but he'd been sick then and lonely. I tried not to hate him for it. I tried. I tore open the envelope. A single key fell out onto the counter with a dull clink. It was old, iron, with a stamped brass tag that read, "Miller & Son Automotive." Alongside it was a folded piece of paper, a deed, and a bus ticket, one way, to a town I'd never heard of. Northwood. Departure time was 11 a.m. It was currently 8:15. "Your grandfather left you that," Claire said, finally turning. Her face was a mask of strained neutrality. "The garage. It's all he had. From what I hear, it's a worthless pile of scrap in a dying town. But it's yours. The property taxes are 3 years overdue, by the way. A lien was just placed on it." She delivered this information with the same emotional investment she'd used to read a grocery list. Milk, eggs, foreclosure. She wanted it to hurt. She wanted me to feel the full weight of the anchor she was handing me just before she pushed me off the boat. "He was your father's father," she added, as if that explained everything. My grandfather. The man my dad never spoke about. The man who, according to family legend, had abandoned his own son. The villain of my childhood stories. And he'd left me a ruin. It felt less like a gift and more like a final, posthumous joke. I looked at the key, then at her. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the key at the wall, to tell her what I thought of her, of my dad for leaving me in her care, of a grandfather who'd been a ghost my whole life. But my throat was tight with a familiar mix of rage and grief. The silence won. It always did. I just nodded. I picked up the key and the ticket, turned, and walked back to my room. The room wasn't really mine. Nothing in it was. The furniture was hers. The bedding was hers. The only things that belonged to me were the clothes in the drawers and a shoebox of photos on the top shelf of the closet. I packed a single duffel bag, a few pairs of jeans, some shirts, the worn-out sneakers I was wearing. I took the shoebox. It was the only thing I couldn't bear to leave behind. As I zipped the bag, my hand brushed against the cool metal of the key in my pocket. A worthless pile of scrap. Maybe it was, but it was also the only thing in the entire world that was mine. An hour later, I was standing at the front door. Claire was there, arms crossed. She didn't offer a ride to the bus station. She didn't offer $100 for the road. She didn't offer a single kind word. "Good luck, Leo," she said. It sounded like good riddance. I stepped out onto the porch and she closed the door behind me. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of my entire life ending. And though I didn't know it yet, the sound of it beginning. The bus ride was 8 hours of rattling windows and the low hum of the engine, a monotonous drone that vibrated through the worn seat and up into my bones. I watched the city bleed into suburbs, then into sprawling farmland that eventually gave way to dense, dark forests of pine and birch. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray, the color of concrete and old dishwater. It matched the hollowness I felt inside. I stared out the window, but I wasn't really seeing the landscape. I was seeing ghosts. My dad's face, gaunt and tired in his last few months. The forced smile he'd give me, telling me Claire was a good woman, that she'd look after me. He was wrong. Or maybe he was just desperate. I pulled the old key from my pocket. Miller & Son Automotive. My dad's name was Michael Miller. I was Leo Miller. Son. Grandson. The name felt like a borrowed coat that didn't fit. I didn't know the man who had forged this key, who had built this place. My dad had painted him as a hard man, a man who chose his failing business over his own family, who walked away and never looked back. "He's a ghost, Leo. Forget him," my dad used to say, his voice thin with an old, brittle anger. So I did, or I tried. Now, that ghost had reached out from the grave and handed me a pile of debt and a key to a building I couldn't even picture. What kind of man does that? I thought about throwing the key out the window, just letting it fly into the blur of roadside weeds. I could get off at the next town, find a job washing dishes and just disappear. Start over. Become a ghost myself. But where would I go? What would I do? I was 18 with a high school diploma that felt like a participation trophy and about $63 in my pocket. The key, as heavy and useless as it seemed, was a destination. It was a place to be. A terrible place by the sounds of it, but a place nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, I deserved it. Maybe this was my inheritance in more ways than one. A legacy of failure, passed down from a man I never knew, through a father I barely got to. The bus wheezed and shuddered, pulling into a small town just as the sun was beginning to set. The light was weak and watery, casting long, distorted shadows across the main street. A sign, its paint peeling, read, "Welcome to Northwood. Population 742. It looked like the sign hadn't been updated in a long time. I had a feeling the population had only gone down. I stepped off the bus and the driver pulled away without a second glance, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The town was quiet. Too quiet. A handful of storefronts lined the street, most of them dark. A diner with a flickering neon sign, a small grocery, a post office, and a lot of empty windows that stared back at me like vacant eyes. I asked the woman behind the counter at the grocery store, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, if she knew Miller & Son Automotive. She gave me a sad little smile. "Oh, honey, you mean old Abe's place." Abe. Abraham Miller. My grandfather. It was the first time I'd heard his name spoken by a stranger. "It's at the end of town," she said, pointing down the road. "Just past the bridge. Hasn't been open in years, not since he passed." She looked me over, taking in my duffel bag and the lost expression I was probably wearing. "You family?" "His grandson," I mumbled, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Her expression softened. Well, I'll be. You have his eyes. I didn't know what to say to that. I just thanked her and started walking. The end of town wasn't far. The sidewalk crumbled into a gravel shoulder. The bridge was a rickety-looking iron structure that groaned as I walked over it, a dark, fast-moving creek rushing below. And there it was, set back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown weeds and creeping vines, was a long, low building made of corrugated tin, rusted to a deep, angry orange. The sign, hanging crookedly from one chain, was barely legible. M-L-E-R and Son, Au, Omotive. The missing letters had left gaping holes. It looked even worse than Claire had described. The windows were boarded up, the huge bay doors were padlocked and covered in a spiderweb of chains, and a small tree was growing up through a crack in the asphalt of the parking lot. A worthless pile of scrap. She was right. For a moment, I just stood there, on the edge of the road, the weight of it all pressing down on me. This was it. This was my inheritance, a tombstone for a family I never knew. My hand went to the key in my pocket. It felt colder now, heavier. I almost turned around. I could walk back to the main street, sleep in a doorway, and figure out a new plan in the morning. A plan that didn't involve this place. But then I looked at the sign again. Miller and Son. That was me. For better or worse, that was me. And I had nowhere else to go. So, with a deep breath that tasted of rust and decay, I walked up the cracked driveway and put the key in the lock of the small side door. The lock was stiff from years of disuse and weather. I had to put my whole body into it, gritting my teeth and turning with all my strength. For a second, I thought the key would snap. Then, with a loud, protesting shriek of metal, the deadbolt finally gave way. The door swung inward into a pitch-black space that smelled of old oil, stale gasoline, and something else. Something like time itself. I stepped inside, out of the fading light, and into the darkness of my own past. The air inside the garage was thick and cold, colder than it was outside. It was a dead, still cold that seemed to have settled into the very foundation of the place. I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found a light switch. I flicked it. Nothing. Of course, the power would have been cut off years ago. I pulled out my phone, its screen a painfully bright beacon in the oppressive dark. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow, dusty cone through the blackness. The garage was huge, much bigger than it looked from the outside. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and grease. Two hydraulic lifts stood like silent, skeletal sentinels in the center of the main bay. Tool chests, the size of small refrigerators, were lined up against one wall, their red paint faded and peeling. Racks of old tires reached toward the high, raftered ceiling, where cobwebs hung like funeral shrouds. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust, a gray blanket that softened every edge and muted every color. It was a place where time had simply stopped. My phone's beam danced across the space, catching on the chrome of a forgotten wrench, the glint of a shattered piece of glass, the ghostly shape of a car hidden under a heavy canvas tarp. It was a 1960s Ford Falcon, its classic lines still visible even under the shroud. It looked like it had been parked there one day and never moved again. It was overwhelming, the sheer scale of the neglect. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint drip, drip, drip of water from a leaky spot in the roof. This wasn't a business, it was a museum of failure. Claire's words echoed in my head, a worthless pile of scrap. I walked deeper into the garage, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet. I ran a hand along the dusty surface of a workbench. Under the grime, the wood was scarred and gouged, a history of work written in its surface. This was where he had stood, my grandfather. This was where he had spent his days. Trying to picture him was impossible. He was just a concept, a ghost. I found a small door at the back of the main bay. It was unlocked. My light revealed a tiny office, no bigger than a closet. There was a metal desk, a single wooden chair, and a heavy-duty filing cabinet. Everything, like the garage, was coated in dust. The air in here was even more stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. On the desk, placed squarely in the center, was a small metal lockbox. It was the only thing in the entire garage that seemed free of dust. It looked like it had been wiped clean, waiting. My heart started to beat a little faster. There was no keyhole, just a simple combination lock with 3 dials. I tried a few random numbers, nothing. I tried birthdays I could think of, mine, my dad's, nothing. I was about to give up, to try and pry it open later, when my eyes caught something scratched into the dusty surface of the desk, right next to the box. It wasn't a number, it was a date. The year the Ford Falcon was made. 1964. I spun the dials. 1, 9, 6, 4. It didn't work. Of course not. It was a 3-dial lock. I felt a surge of frustration. Then I looked at the date again. Maybe it wasn't the year. Maybe it was something else. A birthday. A different birthday. I tried my dad's again, just in case. No. I thought for a minute, my mind racing. What numbers would an old mechanic use? Engine displacements? Firing orders? It was hopeless. I slumped into the dusty chair, which creaked loudly in protest. My flashlight beam was pointed at the filing cabinet. It was an old, ugly, army green thing. One of the drawers was slightly ajar. I pulled it open. It was stuffed with old invoices, receipts, and work orders, all yellowed and brittle with age. I thumbed through them out of a vague sense of curiosity. Miller and Son. The name was on every one. And then I saw it. A name I didn't recognize on a work order from 30 years ago. Customer, Sarah Jenkins. Vehicle, 64 Falcon. Work, engine rebuild. Underneath, in the notes section, a handwritten scribble. Abe, don't forget the new kid's birthday, August 15th. August 15th. I had no idea whose birthday that was. But it was a 3-digit number. I turned back to the lockbox. My fingers were trembling slightly as I set the dials. 8, 1, 5. There was a soft click. The latch sprang open. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath caught in my chest. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not money, not a weapon, not some precious jewel. It was an envelope. A thick, cream-colored envelope, just like the one Claire had given me, but this one was old, the edges soft with age. My name, Leo, was written on the front in a strong, slightly slanted handwriting that was nothing like Claire's. It was the handwriting of a man who worked with his hands. I lifted the envelope out of the box. It was heavy. I could feel the folded pages inside. This was it. This was the real inheritance. Not the building, not the tools, not the debt. This. A message from a ghost. My hands were shaking so much I could barely tear it open. I pulled out a thick sheaf of folded papers and began to read. The letter began without preamble. The ink faded, but the words clear and steady. Leo, it said, if you are reading this, then it means I am gone. It also means you are 18 and you have come to this place alone. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for so much. There are things you need to know, things your father could never bring himself to tell you. He wasn't a bad man, your dad. He was just a haunted one. And I was the ghost that haunted him. I had to stop and take a breath. The voice in these words felt so real, so present, it was like he was in the room with me. I could almost hear the low rumble of it. This wasn't the monster from my family's stories. This was a man. A man full of regret. I continued reading, my phone's light trembling in my hand. This garage, this land, it's yours now. I know it doesn't look like much. It's old, it's broken down in places, and it's drowning in debt. I know because I'm the one who let it get that way. On purpose. A place that looks worthless is a place people ignore. And I needed this place to be ignored. I needed it to be safe. For you. Safe? What did he mean, safe? The letter went on to explain. My father, Michael, hadn't just left Northwood because he and his father had a falling out. He had fled. In his early 20s, my dad had fallen in with a bad crowd, a local crew that dabbled in loan sharking and chop shops, run by a man named Silas Croft. Croft was a predator who preyed on small towns like Northwood, places where people were desperate and the law was thin on the ground. My dad, young and stupid and wanting to prove himself, had borrowed money he couldn't repay. A lot of money. He used it to try and start a business that failed spectacularly. The debt grew, the interest compounded, and soon Silas Croft owned him. Silas doesn't just take his money back, the letter read. He takes your life. He makes you work for him. Your father was terrified. He was being asked to do things, to cross lines he never wanted to cross. He came to me, broken. He confessed everything. I had a choice to make. I could call the cops, but Croft owned half the cops in the county. I could fight them, but I was just one man. Or I could pay the debt. He paid it. He sold off pieces of his own land, emptied his life savings, and borrowed against the garage until it was leveraged to the hilt. He handed every last cent to Silas Croft to buy his son's freedom. But there was a condition. Michael had to disappear. He had to leave Northwood and never come back. Never have any contact with his father again. If he did, the debt was back on, and they would come for both of them. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, my grandfather wrote. I told my own son to leave. I made him think I hated him for what he'd done. I made him believe I was disowning him. It was easier for him to hate me than to live in fear. It was the only way to make sure he'd stay away, that he'd be safe. I broke his heart to save his life. And in doing so, I broke my own. I had to sit down. The dusty office chair groaned under my weight. My vision was blurry. I wasn't just crying for the grandfather I never knew, or the father who had lived a lie. I was crying for the years of resentment I had carried, a resentment that had been so carefully, so painfully constructed just to protect me. The story I had been told my whole life was a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a shield. My grandfather wasn't a villain. He was a hero, and I had never even known his name. The letter wasn't finished. The debt is still out there, Leo. Men like Silas Croft don't forget. They just wait. They've been waiting for me to die. They think the debt passes to the next of kin. They think they own this garage now. They'll come sniffing around. A development company has been trying to buy this land for years, offering pennies on the dollar. It's a front for Croft's operation, a way to launder his money. They'll try to squeeze you out. They'll tell you the back taxes are insurmountable. They'll threaten you. I looked around the dark, derelict garage. It wasn't just a worthless building. It was a battlefield. A target. And I was standing right in the middle of it. The letter had one last part. But I didn't leave you with nothing. I'm a mechanic, boy. I know how to hide things in plain sight. This place is full of secrets. You're a miller. You're smarter than they think you are. Look for the Falcon. It was your father's first car, the one I helped him rebuild. Everything starts there. Don't trust anyone until you talk to Ben Carter. He's a lawyer in town. The only honest one I know. His number is in the desk drawer. Tell him you're Abe's boy. He'll know what it means. Be careful, Leo. Your grandfather, Abraham Miller. I folded the letter, my hands shaking. The silence of the garage was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with questions, with danger, and with a strange, fierce sense of purpose. I stood up and walked back into the main bay, my phone's light cutting through the darkness. I went straight to the Ford Falcon. It sat there, a hulking shape under the tarp. With a deep breath, I grabbed a corner of the heavy canvas and pulled. It came away with a shower of dust, revealing the car beneath. It was beautiful. Even under the grime, you could see it. It was a pale blue, the color of a winter sky. The chrome was pitted, the paint was faded, but the lines were perfect. It was a piece of history. My history. The letter had said everything started here. I opened the driver's side door. It creaked open like a coffin lid. The inside smelled of old vinyl and dust. I ran my flashlight over the dashboard, the cracked steering wheel, the ripped bench seat. What was I looking for? I didn't know. I sat in the driver's seat, the springs groaning. My hands found the steering wheel. I imagined my father sitting here, young and full of hope, before the world came crashing down on him. I imagined my grandfather leaning in through the window, showing him how to fix the engine, his hands covered in grease. A connection, a faint, flickering connection, but it was there. I spent the next hour searching that car. I checked under the seats, in the glove compartment, under the floor mats. Nothing. I popped the trunk. It was empty except for a spare tire and a rusty jack. I was starting to feel a familiar despair creeping in. Had I imagined it all? Was this just the rambling of a lonely old man? Then I remembered something from the letter. I'm a mechanic, boy. I know how to hide things. He wouldn't have hidden it in an obvious place. It would be somewhere clever. Somewhere only a mechanic, or someone who thought like one, would look. I got out of the car and popped the hood. The engine was a massive, greasy block of iron. It looked impossibly complex. But I remembered the work order. Engine rebuild. He had taken this whole thing apart and put it back together. He would know its every secret. My lights scanned the engine bay. The battery was long dead, its terminals corroded. The belts were cracked. But something looked off. The air filter casing, a big, round metal pan on top of the carburetor, was cleaner than everything else around it. There were faint scratch marks around the wing nut that held it in place. My heart started pounding again. I twisted the wing nut. It was stiff, but it turned. I lifted the lid off the air filter casing. Inside, there was no filter. Instead, there was a small, oil-stained leather pouch. I reached in and pulled it out. It was heavy. I unrolled the top of the pouch and tipped the contents into my hand. It wasn't a key. It wasn't a note. It was a thick stack of $100 bills, held together with a brittle rubber band. And tucked inside the stack was a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a ledger. Dates, names, and numbers, all in my grandfather's neat, blocky script. At the top of the page, one name was written and underlined. Silas Croft. It was a record of every payment, every threat, every illegal transaction my grandfather had witnessed or been forced into. It was the evidence, the proof. My grandfather hadn't just paid the debt, he had built a case. He had left me a choice. I could take the money, it looked like tens of thousands of dollars, and disappear, just like my father had. Or I could take this ledger to the lawyer, Ben Carter, and fight. I could finish what he started. Standing there in the cold, dark garage, surrounded by the ghosts of my family, holding a fortune in one hand and justice in the other, I felt the true weight of my inheritance. It wasn't a worthless pile of scrap. It was a legacy, and it was up to me to decide what to do with it. The first night in the garage was the coldest I've ever been. I found a pile of old moving blankets in a storage closet, smelling of mildew and motor oil, and made a nest for myself on the ripped vinyl back seat of the Falcon. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind that rattled the tin roof, sounded like footsteps. I kept the leather pouch with the money and the ledger tucked inside my jacket, my hand resting on it all night. It felt both like a shield and a target. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore, the weak morning light filtering through the grimy, boarded-up windows. The garage looked even more daunting in the daylight. The scale of the decay, the sheer amount of work it would take to bring this place back to life, was staggering. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel hopeless. I felt something else. A flicker of purpose. My first task was to find Ben Carter. I found his number on a faded Rolodex card in the desk drawer, just as the letter had promised. I walked back into town, my phone's battery nearly dead, and found a payphone outside the post office. It felt like a relic from another era, which seemed fitting for Northwood. A man with a calm, steady voice answered on the second ring. "Carter Law?" I'm calling for Ben Carter," I said, my voice hoarse. "This is he." "My name is Leo Miller. My grandfather was Abraham Miller. He told me to call you. He said to tell you I was Abe's boy." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought he'd hung up. Then he spoke, his voice softer now. "Abe's boy. I'll be damned. I've been waiting for this call for a long time, son. Where are you?" "At the garage." "Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead. True to his word, 10 minutes later, a modest, clean sedan pulled into the cracked driveway. A man who looked to be in his late 50s stepped out. He was tall and thin, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen its share of trouble but hadn't been defeated by it. He wore a simple suit that was professional but not flashy. He walked right up to me, his eyes scanning the dilapidated building, then me. He stuck out a hand. "Ben Carter, you look like him, you know. Your grandfather, around the eyes." Just like the woman in the grocery store had said. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the garage. "Let's talk inside. No sense advertising your arrival." We went into the dusty office. I showed him the letter first. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he folded it carefully and handed it back to me. "Abe was a good man," he said, his voice quiet. "Stubborn as a mule and proud, but a good man. He loved your father more than anything. What he did, it cost him everything." Then I showed him the pouch, the money and the ledger. He took the small folded paper and scanned the columns of names and numbers. A low whistle escaped his lips. "Good Lord, Abe," he muttered to himself. "You old fox. He was building this for years. This is dynamite." He looked up at me, his eyes serious. "Leo, your grandfather left you 2 things. The first is a way out." He gestured to the stack of cash. "There's enough there to get you a long way from Northwood. You could start a new life, a clean one. No one would blame you. It's what your father did." "And the second?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The second," he said, tapping the ledger, "is a fight. A nasty one. Silas Croft is a cancer on this town. He's got his hooks in everything. The development company that wants this land, Northridge Properties, is his. The overdue taxes on this place? They were bought up by a shell corporation that traces back to him. He's been boxing you in, waiting for you to show up so he can foreclose and take this land for nothing." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "If we use this ledger, if we take this to the right people, and I know who they are, state investigators who have been trying to build a case against Croft for years, we can burn his whole empire to the ground. But it won't be easy. He'll fight back. He'll threaten you. It will be dangerous." He sat back, letting the weight of his words settle in the dusty air. "Your grandfather gave you the choice he never had. You can run, or you can fight. And whatever you decide, I'll help you do it. I looked around the small, cramped office. I looked at the letter, at the money, at the ledger. For my entire life, I had been running. I had been drifting. I had been a passenger in my own story, shuttled from a dying father to a cold stepmother, pushed toward a future I didn't want. But here, in this forgotten place, I had been given something real. A history. A legacy. A choice. Running felt like my father's path. It was the safe path, the understandable path. But it was also his ghost. It was the haunted life my grandfather had tried to save him from. Fighting. Fighting felt like my grandfather's path. It was the hard path, the dangerous path. But it was the path that led out of the shadows. I'm not running, I said, the words feeling more certain than anything I'd ever said in my life. My grandfather didn't spend the last 20 years of his life in exile just for me to pack a bag and disappear. This place is Miller and Son. I'm the son. I'm staying. We fight. Ben Carter smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it reached his eyes. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. Your grandfather would be proud. He stood up. All right, Leo. Here's what we do first. We get that money into a bank account in your name. We pay those back taxes immediately. That takes the foreclosure threat off the table. It'll show Croft you're not going to be pushed around. Then, I make a copy of this ledger and get it to my contacts. And you. You need to lay low and be smart. And maybe think about getting the power turned on. That afternoon, for the first time, a light came on in the garage. It was a single, bare bulb, but it pushed back the shadows and made the whole place feel different. Less like a tomb, more like a workshop. That night, I didn't sleep in the car. I swept out the office, wiped down the desk, and slept on the floor with the blankets. It wasn't comfortable, but it was mine. I was home. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Ben handled the legal side of things. He paid the taxes, filed the right paperwork to probate my grandfather's will, and officially transferred the deed to my name. He also made good on his promise, delivering a copy of the ledger to a state investigator he trusted. The investigation would be slow, he warned me. Covert. We wouldn't see any sudden arrests. Croft's operation was too entrenched. They would have to build the case carefully. In the meantime, my job was to exist, to hold the line, to make it clear that Miller and Son wasn't for sale. The first sign of trouble came a week later. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the driveway. A man in an expensive suit, the kind that looks out of place in a town like Northwood, got out. He introduced himself as Mr. Hayes from Northridge Properties. He was slick and polished, with a smile that didn't touch his cold, calculating eyes. Leo Miller, I presume, he said, not offering to shake my hand. He looked around the garage with an expression of open disgust. I'll be blunt. This property is an eyesore and a liability. My company is prepared to make you a generous offer to take it off your hands. We'll even forgive the outstanding tax debt. The taxes are paid, I said, my voice steady. I was amazed at how calm I felt. Ben had prepared me for this. Hayes's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Is that so? Well, good for you. Still, the offer stands. It's a fair price. More than fair, considering the state of this place. You could walk away with a nice little nest egg. Start fresh somewhere else. I'm not interested, I said. I'm reopening the shop. He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Reopening? Kid, look at this place. You don't have the money, the tools, or the know-how to fix a bicycle, let alone run a garage. Be smart. Take the money. The answer is no, I said, looking him straight in the eye. His smile vanished completely. The mask was off. "You're making a mistake, kid," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "A big one. This town has a way of swallowing up people who don't know their place. Think about it." He got back in his SUV and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The threat was no longer a vague warning in a letter. It was real. It was standing right in my driveway. But instead of fear, I felt a strange surge of adrenaline, a defiance. This was my place, and I wasn't going to be scared away. I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for Croft's next move. I had to make the garage mine in a real way. I had to bring it back to life. So I started to work. I started with the office. I threw out the mildewed papers, scrubbed the desk and chair, and washed the single window until the light streamed in. Then I moved to the main bay. I spent days, weeks, just cleaning. I swept up mountains of dust and debris. I scraped years of caked-on grease from the concrete floor. I organized the tools, cleaning each wrench, each socket, each screwdriver, and putting it back in its place in the massive tool chests. As I worked, I felt a strange connection to my grandfather. His presence was in everything. In the worn-down handle of a hammer, shaped by his grip. In the faded pinups of classic cars taped to the inside of a locker. In the faint, lingering smell of coffee and cigarettes in the office. I wasn't just cleaning a garage, I was uncovering a life. I found more of his things as I went. A collection of old blues records tucked away on a shelf. A worn copy of Grapes of Wrath with a passage underlined. A faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes. My grandmother, I realized, with a pang of sadness for a whole other person I'd never known. One afternoon, while clearing out a cluttered workbench, my hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity piqued, I pried it up. Beneath it was a small, hidden compartment. Inside was another metal box. This one was smaller, and it was unlocked. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside wasn't money or a ledger. It was a collection of photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of my dad as a little boy, grinning with a missing front tooth, his hands covered in grease as he helped his father work on an engine. Pictures of him as a teenager, proudly standing next to the newly restored Ford Falcon. Pictures of my grandfather, a man I'd only ever imagined, smiling. Actually smiling. He had a warm, open face, and in every picture with his son, he looked immensely proud. And tucked at the bottom of the box was a small stack of letters, tied with a string. They weren't addressed to me. They were addressed to my father, Michael. They were dated over the past 20 years, one for every one of his birthdays since he'd left Northwood. They were letters my grandfather had written but could never send. I sat on the dusty floor and read them, one by one, as the sun set outside. They were filled with the small details of a lonely life. The ache in his back after a long day. The brutal Northwood winters. The news of the town. But mostly, they were filled with love and regret. "Michael, I hope you're happy," one read. "I hope you found a good woman and that you have a family of your own. I hope you tell your kids about me. Maybe just tell them the good parts." In another, he wrote, "I saw a boy today who looked like you at that age. All knees and elbows. It nearly broke my heart in two." The last letter was dated just a few months before he died. His handwriting was shakier. "I'm getting tired, son. I don't know how much longer I have. I know you hate me. I hope one day you'll understand that I did it all for you. Everything I did to keep you safe. I love you, Michael. Always. Dad." I sat there in the dark, the letters in my lap, and I cried. I cried for the father who died believing his own father didn't love him. I cried for the grandfather who died alone, carrying the weight of his secret. And I cried for myself, For the years I had spent hating a man who was the only person who had ever truly fought for me. The next day, something shifted. The work was no longer about defiance or survival. It became an act of love, an act of remembrance. I wasn't just reopening a garage. I was rebuilding a home. I was finishing a story. The threats continued, of course. A broken window one night. A pile of trash dumped in the driveway. Anonymous phone calls with nothing but breathing on the other end. Each time, my resolve hardened. This was my ground. I would not cede it. The town was watching. I could feel their eyes on me. The woman from the grocery store started leaving a small bag of groceries on the doorstep once a week. An old man who shuffled past every day stopped and told me he used to bring his truck here, that Abe was the only honest mechanic in 3 counties. Slowly, cautiously, the community was starting to emerge from the shadows that Croft had cast over it. They saw me working, day in and day out, a single light burning in the old Miller garage, and it was giving them a flicker of something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. One morning, a tow truck pulled into the driveway. It wasn't one of Croft's men. It was a rusty old rig driven by a young guy about my age named Sam. His family owned the town's only other garage, a small operation on the other side of the bridge. I braced myself for a confrontation. "Heard you were reopening," he said, hopping down from the cab. He was wiry and covered in grease, but he had a friendly grin. "Heard you might need a hand." I was stunned. "Why would you help a competitor?" He shrugged. "My dad always said Abe Miller was the best. Said this town went downhill after he closed up. Besides," he added, his grin widening, "Silas Croft has been squeezing my family for years. It's about time someone stood up to him. We'd all be better off if he was gone." That day, Sam helped me get one of the hydraulic lifts working again. It was the first time in 20 years that something in that garage moved with purpose. It was a start. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I wasn't alone. I had my grandfather's letters, I had a lawyer who believed in me, and now I had a friend. I looked at the old, faded sign, Miller and Son. Maybe, just maybe, we could make that mean something again. And this is where the story often ends for a lot of people, right? The big emotional discovery, the choice to fight back. But that's never the whole picture. The choice is just the beginning. The real work, the day-to-day grind of living with that choice, is the part that truly changes you. If you've made it this far, I know this resonates with you on some level. Maybe you've had to make a hard choice, to stand up for something when it would have been easier to walk away. If you have, I want you to hit that like button. Let me know you're here, that you get it. Because this community is for people who understand that the fight is worth it. Now, let's get back to the story. The months that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. With Sam's help, and the occasional bit of advice from his dad, a gruff old mechanic named Earl who knew my grandfather well, I started to learn the trade. My days were filled with the smell of grease and gasoline, the screech of metal, the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, and an engine roaring back to life. I started small. Oil changes, tire rotations. The people of Northwood, seeing that I was serious, started to trickle in. They came with their old pickup trucks and their beat-up sedans, not just for repairs, but to share stories about my grandfather. They told me about his kindness, how he'd let people pay in installments when times were tough, how he'd stay open late to help a stranded traveler. I wasn't just fixing their cars, I was reconnecting the town to a piece of its own better history. With every car that rolled out of my bay, running better than when it came in, I felt like I was honoring him. I was becoming the sun on the sign. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was working quietly in the background. The state investigation was moving forward, building its case brick by brick using my grandfather's ledger as a roadmap. The pressure on Silas Croft was mounting, but it was invisible, a tightening net he couldn't see yet. He knew something was wrong, though. His attempts at intimidation escalated. One night, The tires on the Falcon were slashed. Another time, my new sign was spray painted with threats. It was terrifying. There were nights I'd lie awake in the small apartment I'd built for myself above the office, listening to every sound, my heart pounding. But then I would look at the photograph of my grandfather and my dad, and I would find my courage again. The turning point came on a cold autumn evening. Ben called me. "It's time, Leo," he said, his voice tense with anticipation. "They're moving on him. Tonight." He told me to stay in the garage, lock the doors, and not open them for anyone. Hours passed. The silence of the town was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Then, just after midnight, I saw them. A convoy of unmarked state police cars, moving silently down the main street, their lights off. They swept through Northwood like ghosts, hitting Croft's properties, the Northridge Development Office, a warehouse on the edge of town, and his own secluded house up on the hill. There were no sirens, just the quiet, efficient execution of a plan years in the making. The next morning, the town was buzzing. Silas Croft and a dozen of his associates, including Mr. Hayes, were in custody. The news was on every local channel. Racketeering, money laundering, extortion. The charges were extensive. My grandfather's ledger was the key that had unlocked it all. The cancer that had plagued Northwood for decades was finally being cut out. When I opened the garage doors that morning, the sun was shining. People were standing in small groups on the street, talking, some of them smiling for the first time in years. The woman from the grocery store came over and gave me a hug. Earl, Sam's dad, clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes watery. "Abe would be damn proud of you, son," he grunted. Damn proud. The fight was over, the garage was safe, the town was free. But my story wasn't finished. With Croft gone, the fear that had held Northwood in its grip for so long began to fade. A new energy took its place. People started fixing up their storefronts. A new family moved into an abandoned house down the street. The town was coming back to life, and Miller and Son Automotive was at the heart of it. I used the rest of the money my grandfather had left me, not to run, but to invest. I bought new equipment for the shop. I gave Sam a full-time job. I restored the Ford Falcon, bringing its pale blue paint back to a brilliant shine. It sits in the front bay of the garage now, not as a ghost of the past, but as a symbol of our future. A reminder that some things are worth saving. I never became a master mechanic like my grandfather, but I became a good one. More importantly, I became a part of a community. I found a family not in blood, but in the shared struggle and quiet loyalty of a small town that refused to die. My inheritance wasn't a worthless auto shop. It wasn't a pile of cash or a ledger full of secrets. My real inheritance was a second chance. A chance to understand my past, to choose my future, and to build a home. It was the gift of purpose, left for me by a man I never met, but whom I came to love with all my heart. His name was Abraham Miller, and I am his grandson, and this is my home. This story, for me, is about realizing that what we inherit isn't always about money or property. Sometimes, the most valuable thing we're given is a story that needs a new ending. It's a chance to right a wrong, to finish a fight, or to simply build something good where something broken used to be. Home isn't always the place you start. Most of the time, it's the place you build for yourself, with your own two hands, surrounded by the people who choose to build it with you. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you had to choose between the easy path and the right one. What did you do? I want you to share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I believe that by sharing our experiences, we remind each other that we're not alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe and join our community. We're all just trying to find our way home.